for this event. At this time, I'd like to bring up the Executive Artistic Director of Gemini Inc., who is going to say a couple of words, and then we'll continue with the introduction of the panelists. If the panelists can go ahead and make your way up to the stage, please. We'd appreciate it. And this is
the gifty one, Sheila Black.
Sheila Black, who's the Executive Artistic Director of Gemini Inc., our co-sponsor.
I just wanted to briefly say how Gemini Inc. is the literary arts organization that serves San Antonio. And when Juan Tejada, can you all hear me, came to us with this project, I was incredibly honored to be asked to co-sponsor it, because I think it's one of the most important, and as you saw from that film, unfortunately controversial questions of our city, our state, and our country at this point in time. And the question is, how do we decide the stories we tell each other, the histories, the sociologies we study, and we present to our children? I know often in our daily lives we talk about what assets we have. You know, in my case, my slender bank balance, my car that I owe payments on. But we all know that we own many things that are intangible but equally real, and in many ways even more precious to us. These include our memories, our impressions, who and what we love, our neighborhoods, the places we come from, our identities. And our identities in terms of sexuality, ethnicity, disability, which I could argue is also a culture. And those are very important because they're often the experience or wisdom we gain from moving in the world. It might be worth pointing out that the term cultural capital originally was used in 1973 by the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, and he was curious about why. He had a theory about this called the theory of social reproduction, why hierarchies so often reproduce themselves. And he thought this can't be all down to money alone, and so he came up with this term cultural capital. And he said it was social assets that promote social mobility beyond economic means. Examples can include education, intellect, style of speech, dress, and even physical appearance. And what this implied, interestingly, I think it's a very deficit definition initially. What it implied was cultural valuation. How do people value certain cultural traits or presentations? And one of the questions this panel will take on is, how do we turn that idea of cultural valuation, which is a deficit model, to a model which is a person who's in charge of an organization devoted to telling stories, I might call cultural wealth. How do we leverage all the things we know from our experience of the world to increase and exceed ourselves? Or more to the point, how does our cultural capital make that cultural wealth play in how we educate our children? I think that's a topic that has to be of vital importance to all of us. And so I would love you to join me in thanking Professor Tejada for putting this together, Oliver Jones, Carmen Vasquez, the Office of Student Engagement here at Palo Alto College, and our very distinguished panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila, and I also want to thank the staff from Gemini Inc., the University Without Walls program, who Erica Morgan, the former director of that program, started off, and then Ana Sanchez, who's here, took over. And I want to thank Lucinda, the PR director at Gemini Inc., and all the staff at Gemini Inc. Briefly, the title of this discussion here is Perspectives on Ethnic Studies. Is a multicultural education a civil right? As you saw in the film, a lot of these programs, being African American studies, Chicano studies, American Indian studies, women's studies, began as a result of the civil rights movement of the 60s and early 70s. So these programs came into being primarily at universities, and little by little since then they've been taking these programs away. As you saw, this was a model program at the high school level one of the only ones, if not the only one of its kind in the entire nation that was very successful. And as a result of some fears on certain levels, they took those away. So, a quick comment on the procedures for this panel discussion. Each one of our distinguished panelists is going to have 5 minutes to make an introductory statement on the title of this panel. And then we're going to have about a 45-minute discussion amongst the panelists on this important educational issue. And then we're going to have about 45 minutes for questions and answers from you, the audience, to our panelists, and a discussion back and forth. I will be moderating this panel, so I will be sitting over there. And hopefully, I'm sure that we're going to have a lively discussion. Now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our distinguished panelists. First, we have Dr. Carmen Tafolla, who is the writer-in-residence, a very fine poet, writer, and educator, writer-in-residence at the University of Texas at San Antonio, and San Antonio's first poet laureate. Next to Carmen, we have Dr. Lisa Moore, who's a professor of English, Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. And next to Dr. Moore, we have Dr. Cary Latimore, who's the co-chair of the History Department and former director of the African American Studies Department at Trinity University here in San Antonio. Dr. Cary Latimore. And last, but definitely not least, at the far end over there, we have Mr. George Rodriguez, who's the former president of the San Antonio Tea Party and president of the South Texas Political Alliance. And I think maybe we'll just go down the line. We'll begin with Carmen here, and I'll be sitting over there with her 5-minute statement.
Certainly the film gave us much to discuss, but I am very grateful to Juan Tejeda for having selected the title, which I think was a stroke of genius, is Multicultural Education, a Civil Right. When scholars examine the nature of human rights, and I like to put it in that broader context, they talk in terms of 3 generations of human rights. The first generation is what's often called the blue rights, the hard, the non-negotiable, the access to liberty and participation in political life, without which involvement in a government becomes rather shallow and empty. So if you are part of a nation, part of your blue rights, part of your first generation of human rights, is participation in the political life of a nation. Second generation of human rights, very quickly, are those related to equality, which are fundamentally economic, social, cultural. You can't be equal in a society if you don't have access to the economics and the social life and the cultural life of that nation. Third generation is what some critics will start to say is kind of more out there. It's the Universal Bill of Human Rights, international organizations, the European Social Charter. Many of them refer to the third generation of human rights, the Stockholm Declaration of the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, and some people consider it softer, or the green rights, and that is rights that have to do with the support of the human being's access to a society. That is the right to self-determination, economic, social development, healthy environment, natural resources, communication and communication rights, participation in cultural heritage, intergenerational equity and sustainability. Very, very briefly, these are all things that are not attainable if you don't have a sense of belonging in a culture and of your culture being important. That is, if you don't feel that you or your culture has made a contribution to this universe, or to this planet, or to this society, or to this city, it's very hard to have full communication, to participate in your heritage, to have self-determination, or to develop economic and socially. Now, that's the bottom line. Let's move up to the more important ones. If we look at the second generation, again, this was economic, social, and cultural involvement. How can we be economically involved if we're not receiving equal educational access? And if you're not equally engaged in an education because you don't identify with it, you're not involved. But I'd like to take it right up to number one, the first generation human rights. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. No one's going to argue with that. If you're in the United States and you believe in the Constitution, it's okay. These are our rights. We have a right to participate in political life. How participatory are high school dropouts in what goes on in the city? How much are they able to even afford to get to a city council meeting, to take the time for a city council meeting, if their struggle is with basic economic survival, because they do not have an education? What we saw in this film was a program that was getting children affirmed, thinking, analytical, graduating from high school, enrolling in college, and being successful, participatory citizens in their environment. So, I think if we examine multicultural education, and that is multicultural, it's not one culture. And I think if you listen closely, you saw that while a lot of affirmation was going on in the Latino culture, there was an examination, there was an analysis of what cultures have to offer and what people from many different cultures were teaching. We have to accept that a multicultural education affirms all of the citizens and respects all of the citizens and makes it possible for all of the citizens to be successful. One little side note. They didn't take the film all the way to where the books were being removed from the classrooms. And the books were being removed from classrooms. When the books were removed from classrooms, all books that had been involved in the curriculum, including William Shakespeare's The Tempest, were taken out of the classrooms, away from the students, boxed up, and declared off limits, not to be studied anymore. William Shakespeare, by the way, if you didn't know, is not a Latino. At least we don't think he is, but it's possible. One of the books that was also removed was my book, Curandera, which had been adored for about 30 years in the classrooms and used by the students because it was one of the few things they found that reflected their reality, their culture, and their ability to express their own voice, their own experience. And students cried when they saw their books being boxed up and sent to the book graveyard. So I see it as a move in paranoia, anti-intellectualism, but especially it was a threat population, a population that had not been getting an education, that was now being successful and outspoken, and therefore it raised the ire of people who were concerned about those people, quote unquote, whom they did not see as having contributed to or been a part of our America. And we caught those little comments in there several places. I think we have to be aware that I don't think we're dealing with a black and white. I don't think we're dealing with totally evil people who wanted to do destruction. I think they thought they were doing good. But when you listen between the lines to statements like, this is the U.S., it is our U.S., and you guys stay away from it, those are statements that reflect those individuals' lack of a multicultural education.
Thank you, Carmen. And I will try to get your attention and give you like 1 minute left. I know it's 5 minutes isn't that long, so we want to be able to give everybody equal time. Next, Dr. Lisa Moore.
Thanks. inviting me. It's really an honor to participate in this discussion with all of you today. Is multicultural education a civil right? Well, I'm here today as an educator and a writer, not a legal scholar or a civil rights specialist. But what I want to suggest, based on more than 20 years of college teaching, is that if it's not multicultural, we can't really call it an education, can we? Let's just call it half an education. And I don't think that's good enough for anyone who walks through the doors of a school, a college, or a university. Multicultural education is not just for those who are fighting for their civil rights. Multicultural education is one of the gifts that civil rights movements have given to everyone. I'm an English professor, as Juan mentioned, and one of the courses I teach is world literature. Years ago, in the 1940s at the University of Texas, when that course was named, the world in world literature meant Europe. Students read classical Greek literature in translation, Enlightenment French philosophy in translation, and Russian short stories in translation. It was a great class, but it wasn't world, and it wasn't English. When I started to teach the class myself, I took as my starting point the idea that English is a global language. It has already traveled the world on the roots of trade and colonialism, and it's the native language of many people from Australia, Nigeria, South Africa, Hong Kong, India, and many other places who've adopted English into their existing literary traditions and enriched it. Opening up to a multicultural approach to world literature allowed me to teach students how important it is to read literature in its original languages rather than in translation. Though translation can be great as a way in, but ideally it would inspire you to learn Spanish to read Don Quixote or Octavio Paz, or to really appreciate the experiments our Latino writers like Gloria Anzaldúa and Junot Diaz are carrying out when they write in the supple Spanish English so characteristic of the United States and one of our gifts to world English. My class is just one class, and I hope and expect students will take others to read different books and hear different views. That's multicultural education. And I want to point out that La Raza class that the students were taking was one class. It was not the whole curriculum. It was not crowding out other approaches. It was enriching them and giving students a reason to care about what they learned in history class, in math class, in the other classes that they were expected to take. The other fields in which I teach are women's and gender studies and gay and lesbian studies. And both of these fields, like the idea of multicultural education itself, grew from the perception that our schools and universities had limited themselves by teaching as if women, people of color, gays and lesbians, and others who had historically been denied rights had left no record or none of value to history. As feminist and gay studies exploded starting in the 1970s, we created the context within which to understand and hear a fuller chorus. This painstaking research and brave teaching is why now no American literature syllabus would be complete without masterworks like Toni Morrison's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, Beloved, which is about an enslaved mother in Reconstruction, Ohio, or San Antonio writer Sandra Cisneros' luminously beautiful, multiple prize-winning short story collection, Woman Hollering Creek, which is read all over the country. It's why now, when we read Shakespeare's sonnets addressed to a beloved young man, we no longer have to try to pretend that they're not love poems. Multicultural education has given the literature we knew already back to us, enriched, and opened up possibilities for new voices to emerge from both the past and the present, new voices that offer us the inspiration and delight of great art. There's a deep relationship between freedom movements and knowledge. The truth shall make you free. That's a quotation from the Bible that's blazed across the main building at the University of Texas at Austin, where I teach. Multicultural education is simply the fulfillment of this promise to search out the truth in the service of freedom for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. Dr. Latimore.
Okay, is this working?
Yes.
I was worried about the acoustics in here, but they sound pretty good.
Is it too loud out there? Is it all right? We're getting a little bounce back up here, so I'm just wondering how y'all are hearing it out. It's okay there? Good, thank you.
So am I coming through a little bit better now? Okay. Wow, I mean, we've had two great discussions, and I have to admit that I feel a little bit awkward, because my views on ethnic studies and multicultural education are constantly evolving. And I have to admit, they're not completely set. I see many different ways about this issue. Maybe it's because of my own background. I grew up in Virginia. I grew up in a rural area of Virginia on a farm. And the idea of multicultural was just basically black and white, because that was all that we had. I grew up in integrated schools. Yet those integrated schools, on one side of the gym, blacks would sit, and on the other side, whites would sit. And people would say that that was just the way that it was, and nobody understood any different. Come February, we talk about Black history, and that was our Black history component. So that was the thing that I grew up with. When I went to college, I learned a little bit more, and then when I went to graduate school and eventually earned my PhD, I found that multiculturalism had a different meaning. Sometimes when you're African American and you are applying to a college or university, you want to be the people who are portraying you as the person that does that black stuff, or the person that wants you to do the Latino stuff, and people want you to do this, and they put you in a box. And so I think that on the left and on the right, there are sometimes questions and problems when we deal with issues of multiculturalism and issues of ethnic studies. When I was hired at Trinity, I requested that they not just see me as an African American historian, but as a historian, and that they allow me to teach things that are just not centered on the African American experience, but centered also on other experiences as well. I don't know where that's quite going with that, but I think the question is, sometimes we become self-segregated when we specifically talk about ethnicity and multiculturalism, and we get beyond the idea that America is this culture that sometimes imposes, but out of what America is, something does emerge. Do I know my African cultures that are part of me? No, I don't. Do I know where my European ancestors were from? No, I don't. Do I know all the Native American ancestors that are within me? No, I don't. So in a sense, I have no other option but to say that, I have to look at all of those aspects. And so when I teach all of them. And so multiculturalism is not something that anybody has to ask me to do. It's just something that I do. It's part of my classes because it's who I am. Now, if we look at some of the main questions about this kind of education, I guess part of it is where we are in our society. One, our society is rapidly changing. I'm looking around here and I'm seeing the changes. Where I grew up, it was just, as I said, a black and white. I did not know a Latino until I got to college. That may seem strange to people, but I didn't. And then even then, I didn't know they were all from more rich countries in South America. It took until I moved to Atlanta, probably my third or fourth year, before I really knew people that truly identify themselves as Latino or Latina. But I think the questions are, on one end, we see a rising minority population that will soon become a majority, Black, Hispanic, and others. And there are questions about that. interpret ethnic and multicultural studies reflects the diversity of the experiences. And maybe in some sense, in trying to separate ourselves, we force a reality that isn't quite there. And so we say, these people are like that, and they have this ethnic group or that background. You know, I have a good friend who sees himself as triracial. And he says he doesn't fit in any one of these groups. Well, sometimes we want to place him where we think he should be. And I think that that's sometimes one of the issues. I think the issue of cultural capital is important, but I also think that the value of the individual is also important. And I've got about 1 minute, so I'll stop in a minute. Is it a civil right? That's a very good question. Is it the job of a university or a school to educate in certain ways? I'm not sure if that's a civil right. When I think of civil rights, I think about going into a building. I think about those kinds of things. I don't know about an educational experience. Maybe not. I think about my mother who couldn't go into a room, or she couldn't go to a water fountain. My father who couldn't walk on one side of the street. I think of those things as civil rights. I think of the rest as something that I have to do myself. I'm an individual. As a man, I see myself as I have a responsibility to do and to make agency the way that I live. And nobody, no institution, no control can tell me what I can or what I cannot do. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Dr. Latimore. Mr. George Rodriguez.
Good morning.
Might need to bring that up a little closer, George. Yeah.
I didn't want to look like a crooner or something like that.
Sing.
Wait till it gets going. You don't want me to. First of all, let me thank Dr. Tejeda for inviting me. Usually when I or other folks like myself are invited to these gatherings, it's to become the piñata. And I hope that you will listen logically to my presentation and not get too emotional. But I will begin by telling you that I do not feel that it's a civil right. I think that a civil right is something that's laid out in the Constitution of the United States. And beyond that, an education is something that's free, and that's something that is up to the individual to gain. There's nothing to preclude a person from learning about their background, about their history, their genealogy, I would say, not their history, because I'm not sure, because again, like was just mentioned a few moments ago, as a Mexican-American, as a Chicano, as a Spanish-speaking surname person, whatever you want to call me, my experience has been very, very different from what I've read in books like Bless Mi Ultima and other propaganda, that type, and I'll put it out there like that. It just depends. I mean, there are many types of Mexican Americans. In the Tea Party, of our 20,000 people that were registered of our organization, well over 40% were Mexican American. So, what is their inkle? They view themselves as Americans first. I think that what we've got right now, and it was a very interesting propaganda film that we just watched a few moments ago. And that's how I view it, because I saw pictures of these young people dressed in brown with berets, looking militant. Well, what is that supposed to be? I see Ms. Tafolla down there being paid as a poet laureate for the city of San Antonio out of our tax money, and I don't understand that. Perhaps HEB should give a grant for that. Right? But I don't understand why money that could be used to fix infrastructure should go for a poet. I'm sorry, I just don't understand that. I understand that it's very important for Chicanos to learn about their experience. I want to be sure that you understand that I grew up in that period. I was a member of Mayo, the Mexican American Youth Organization. I remember going to Washington State on one occasion with Mario Compián to a presentation, and he spoke in Spanish, and half of the Chicanos there, who were very militant, didn't even understand Spanish. You know? So what kind of Chicanos were they? The fact of the matter is that we should be Americans first, learn American history, and Chicano history, gay studies, everything else, should be part of that. And I don't really understand why and how you need to have it balkanized, why you need it to be separated. If you want to specialize that in that, fine and dandy. I think what has happened is that we have what I would call the educational industrial complex. You have folks that make a living out of specializing in university studies, creating these programs, and then trying to find funding for it, whether it comes from the government or wherever. And again, that's fine and dandy. I support it. I think that it's great that we should learn about it. But I'm just not sure that it should be a civil right, or it is a civil right. I think that it's everybody's right to learn, and fine and dandy. We go for that. I think what is necessary is that we teach good manners, and I think that begins in the home. And teaching good manners should be reflected in the way that you treat an individual, or you treat each other. And I believe very much in strengthening the family. I think one of the problems, if you want to discuss Hispanic or Chicano culture, is you know, the number of out-of-wedlock births and the disintegration of the Chicano family at this point. I think that that's something that we should be worried about. I think we should worry about that all over the place, of how, you know, Chris Rock can make the statement that President Obama is our daddy and Michelle is our mommy, and we should listen to him. That's what he said yesterday. Somehow nobody questions that. They are not my mommy or daddy. They are elected officials. Or at least he is. I don't know about her. So that's where I'm coming from, and you know, I'll be glad to discuss whatever questions you got from me.
Thank you. That's very good. Okay, so some very good opening statements there. I guess fundamentally the question, and some of you have answered it, and others I think moved around it somewhat, is that do we have a right to learn about our own history and culture in our schools? We pay the taxes, you know, in our different communities and across the nation. Is a multicultural education a right of ours? Should a true multicultural history that's representative of this nation be taught to our children from kindergarten through university settings? And Carmen, I'm going to let you go ahead and respond one more time, and I know there was a couple of things that were said that you might even want to respond to also.
You know, I think I have a right to know about Ben Franklin and to know about the Puritan heritage of this country, not because I had biological ancestors that were Puritans, but because it becomes a vital part of the history of this nation. But I also think that what we in Texas so ignorantly call the Anglo-American, which if you're not from Texas, it means anybody who's not Latino or Black, you're Anglo. You may think you're Jewish or Polish or Irish, but if you come to Texas, you're now Anglo. I think that the dominant culture, the Anglo-American culture of this nation, has a right to know about all the Latinos that helped build this country. That multicultural education, were it really in effect in these Tucson schools at the time that these young people started and felt so oppressed. They were not taught to feel oppressed. They stated that they felt disengaged from the schools. They felt not a part, not wanted, not desired. And there's a big difference here that people don't often talk about. There's a difference between discussing something and endorsing something. There's an elephant in the room, and if we all don't talk about it, then it won't exist, right? If we look at the most American rights, the right to justice. In order to have justice, we need to be aware of injustices. We need to be able to discuss them. We need to be able to know that they're happening. So discussing oppression, discussing racism, or discussing sexism does not make racism or sexism or oppression happen. It allows us to deal with it. It allows us to analyze it, to find better ways around it so that we do not repeat those mistakes. And I think this was very, very clearly stated with the young people that we heard speak about their own disengagement and then their own involvement, their own desire to be a part of society, to reflect, to move, to change, to have things happen. In terms of the poet laureate comment, and this is not about the poet laureate here, but it is about education. And I may be a diehard enough educator to believe that there is no civilization without an education of some sort, that there is no effective government, and there certainly is no democracy if we do not have an effective education. We have a crisis situation in this nation. It is typical of the populations of color, the minority populations. We have more than half of our Latinos in the United States not graduating from high school. I do not place all the blame on them. I think young people do take responsibility for themselves, but they also respond to their society. And looking at San Antonio's role in education, our mayor was visionary enough to see that literacy and literature are related, that without story and a sense of meaning and symbolism to turn young people on, they have no way to engage themselves in education. And I believe that was what the poet laureate was a significant enough role to take 0.0012% of maybe 1 month's budget to endorse the poet laureate.
Yeah. Can you hear me out here? Lisa, did you want to respond to something there?
Sure, I could.
Okay.
You want to go down the road again?
Sure, I think I'm just kind of going down the road unless somebody wants to jump in.
I actually wanted to note lots of points of connection and agreement between myself and the speaker at the end. As you put it, Chicano history should all be part of that. It should be part of anybody's education or the ability of somebody to feel like they can participate in public life. And I think that also the idea that there's some things we don't like about the way African American studies has become institutionalized, and we want to be critical of that. What those indicate to me is that this knowledge explosion that came out of the great civil rights movements of the mid-20th century has already happened. And it's now just, it's like the Cesar Chavez quote at the end of the film said, you can't unknow what you already know. So now we know that American history is a bigger, fuller picture than just the Founding Fathers. We don't forget about the Founding Fathers. But we can't put the genie back in the box. And we don't want to, and we don't need to. Because this is not an either-or proposition. It really is a question of learning both the more traditional or mainstream approaches and the approaches that are going to help particular students, in the case of the film, these students in the La Raza classes in Tucson, feel connected to their studies in a way that's going to make them productive citizens, which certainly is a benefit to all of us. Certainly going to help the teenage birth rate. It's certainly going to help the economic self-sufficiency of these students. It's going to contribute to the economy for all of us. So the benefit of knowledge and education for someone who might otherwise not have it, who might drop out, who might go down the wrong path because they don't have a teacher who can really see the human value of that person and encourage them to stay in school, that's going to have an impact beyond just that one particular life. It's already happened, so it's a question now of trying to pursuit of happiness really is available. The uniforms have been mentioned a couple of times, the brown shirts and the berets, and I think that people say brown shirts because that sounds like Nazis or something, but you know, those are tan shirts and they look like English Boy Scouts to me. I grew up in Canada and the Boy Scout uniforms look different than they do in the United States. They look kind of like that, and they were based on military uniforms. So I don't think that you can just point to the uniforms and say, see, Nazis. I think that what those young people wearing the berets thought they were doing was protecting their friends from police violence, which, let's face it, there's a history of police violence against protesters in this country. Could have happened, right? So they weren't armed. They were kids. They were showing that they were part of the club, just like Boy Scouts.
I really do apologize, and sometimes I wish I had more rigid beliefs on something in this case than I do. But I think, one of my things I always try to be open, and I agree with Dr. Moore. This stuff is already happening, and so the way I'm discussing is I take it for granted that I will include, if I'm teaching a course on the Old South, I will include all aspects that I can. My questions tend to come from the implementation of how we go about it. One of my questions about African American studies, Latino studies, and others is not that I question it, but it's the implementation. And maybe it's part of my own background. I remember when I was young, I was always the kid who was saying, the man, the system, the this, the that, these people out here are trying to hold me back. And I can come up with a variety of different, I don't use the word excuses, but explanations for why I didn't succeed. And whereas that may be true to an extent, it certainly didn't help my performance as a student to have all of this kind of stuff, this baggage of oppression, if you will. Now, oppression is important. It's a very important, it happens. Bottom line, it happens. But when it becomes a part of your persona, it then becomes a load that the person who's supposed to oppress, a double load on that person. And so I'm for liberation studies in a sense. How do people who come from these communities find ways out of that? And I'm not sure that some of the ways that we implement ethnic studies and multiculturalism gets to that aspect. We have a lot of times it comes from paternalistic attitudes. We need, this person, you were brought over here in 1619, you were enslaved. For the next 200 years, you were enslaved. And then Abraham Lincoln came and freed you, which he didn't. But that's another thing. We go on about that, so I won't get into it. Then, we had a civil rights movement and this or that. And, we even had people in 2008 saying, well, it took a president to pass the bill. And so in a sense, all kind of agency was taken away from people like me. And that it was these other people who did this. But that crystallizes within the individuals part of these groups a nihilistic attitude, which I think prevents them from engaged citizenship. And so I think we have to be very careful with how some of these things are implemented. Now, I'm not just saying scare tactics, but I think we have to be very careful. Balkanization is it happens. It happens in academia. We balkanize people. Unfortunately, part of that is because academics always seem to be open to bringing in people who are different. So we form Black studies for them. We have gay and lesbian studies. So they go do their stuff. But we'll have these other positions for everybody who fits the mainstream. So multiculturalism and ethnic studies is an issue for both left and right. I'll leave it at that.
Did you want to? Thank you, George. Did
Sure.
you want to respond to that, George?
I think, again, that what we've got is a situation of how are these programs, or how are these studies presented, how are they taught? You can teach anything. You can teach anything depending on, the style. You can teach it with anger. You can teach it with unemotional, logical manner. You can teach it in various ways. And I think the fear that is taught sometimes in these, I mean, the words that are tossed around, oppression, that the kids felt some kind of oppression. I don't know. I'm sorry. You know, growing up, my parents were well educated, and discussing this with Juan when we first met, he said, "Well, gosh, it almost sounds elitist." Well, maybe it is. You know, success. When you have success, isn't that moving into the elite circles? And isn't that what education is all about? That you're trying to get people to move into a successful realm. You know, programs that where they've got teaching women how to dress for success. By definition, isn't that a situation where, you know, people are being taught to dress a little bit in an elitist manner? Well, you know, maybe so. But elitism doesn't have to be negative, doesn't have to be bad. And I think that that one of the headaches that I've got is I consistently hear these ethnic studies programs being taught with anger. It's the United States' fault. It's those Indian, and I'm sorry, I'm going to throw it out there again. Another one. There's a lot of whites out there that have guilt complexes about being white. I'm sorry, you feel that. You know, apologize for yourself, but don't apologize for me. You know, I am Hispanic, I am Mexican American, I am Chicano. I don't know what I'm American first. You know, and the bottom line to it is that whether or not this is a civil right, and whether or not you have, you know, we should, as taxpayers, be funding a program where Che Guevara is lauded as a revolutionary hero when he was a murderer. I don't know. I'm sorry. You know, that's to me. That's you know, to me. I'm sorry. I have a very somebody who was anti-American. You know, and a communist and a murderer. I'm sorry. I have a difficult time with that. You know, but on the other hand, you know, I really, again, I feel very, very strongly. If you want to learn about your history, if you want to learn, I'm very, very much for genealogy. I think everybody should learn about their I'm a great genealogist. I think you should learn about your background, learn about your parents, and I think that you should be taught proper manners at home. So that way you don't use the N-word, so that way you don't aren't nasty to people in the street. You should be taught that at home. And I think that it's very, very important that family values be reinstated.
So you don't believe that ethnic studies necessarily should be taught in the schools?
I don't. I'm sorry. I think the history of Hispanics, I think the history of Black, can just as well be included and folded into American history. Period.
Right, and it is. That's why I'm saying I think there's a lot of overlap between what you're saying and what we as ethnic studies educators actually do.
It's right. Multicultural and ethnic studies came about because the curriculum was deficient. When an entire literature curriculum of school district does not reflect more than 50% of the population of the city, it's not serving the educational purposes of literature.
But has that not changed?
And
yes, because of multicultural education.
And part of what has made it change is part of what
So now you can
has
study
happened.
it, but now you can study it. Now you can study it.
And we need to continue. I mean, the history of terrible civil rights in this country is one of continuing to stand up for encroachments on civil rights. So that's what the students are doing.
Separated out.
There's something very touching to me about high school students holding up signs saying "Save our classes." I mean, what could be more American? The classes that they're taking that they love, and then keep them in school
What's
so they can go to math.
Going to catechism, that goes after school. They don't teach that in college.
Yeah, catechism is about religion, and we're talking about the literature, the history, the social studies, basic education.
Can that not be learned after school as well?
No. Education, history, and literature of the people of a nation are taught during the school day. They are not extraneous to the curriculum. They are part of the curriculum. And right now, it is better than it was 20 years ago. And part of why it is better is because we had to go through such programs as ethnic studies because it was not allowed anywhere else. And when people saw that the ethnic studies programs were being successful and interesting, they began to incorporate it into the rest.
How far do we divide ethnic studies?
The thing is, it's
Puerto Rican studies, Cuban studies, Mexican American studies.
There's no design for that. It's called
and
American.
that's excellent. And it has an impact then on how something called American literature is taught, or American history, because the genuinely new scholarly discoveries, the knowledge explosion, and the top-notch teaching that was happening in those programs began to seep back into the places that initially said, this doesn't meet our academic standards, and transform them for the better. That's why you won't find a history department or an English department at any college in the country that doesn't now include writing by women and people of color. And that is to everyone's benefit. That's why we keep fighting to make the pie bigger.
Yeah, education is a process. We're not there. We're not perfect. But if we want to have a democracy, and I do, I want the full involvement of all parts of the population, then all parts of the population have to have a respect for the power that culturally diverse groups have given. That doesn't mean Latino studies, and African study, and African American studies, part of what you were addressing, Governor. It's not, it doesn't mean separating people off. What it means is developing a diverse curriculum, a multicultural curriculum that allows everyone to be involved, that allows us to honestly state the contributions that have come from different groups, and to also recognize the contributions of people who have the limitations of their time periods and say, I love Ben Franklin. He was a brilliant man, but he was a product of his time, as was Thomas Jefferson. And as part of that time, there was a bit of an incitation to believe that peoples of color, and by the way, peoples of color, those of you out there who have Italian or a Slovak or any kind of Eastern European heritage, they were talking about Judas. They were talking about people that were not of strictly Nordic, Germanic, or English background. They were hesitant to believe that these people had any real contributions to make to this country. And this was part of our history. It doesn't take away from the Founding Fathers. It doesn't take away from our history. It adds to our ability to analyze, appreciate, and move forward in society.
Could I add? I agree with so much of all of this. And there are some things that I agree over here. For me, I think my issue is where we have reached in American society, and that when somebody says something that we don't like, we don't have a discussion with them. And one of the things I like about this is that we're actually having a discussion. But, when words like racist, sexist, homophobe, religious, spiritual phobe, these are conversation pieces that we seem to have more in our society today. And those are conversation pieces which are meant to shut down conversation. I don't want to talk to you, so it's over. You are less than me, shut up.
I actually think that's a result of what Carmen was referring to. It's the elephant in the room syndrome. I actually think that classrooms where you learn to openly and respectfully talk about things like racism, sexism, homophobia, makes you more courteous, because it doesn't become a question of, in my class, I say, a person is not a racist. It's not like having red hair, but there can be institutional forms of privilege that work through you, whether you intend that or not, and you can find a way to notice that, talk about it, and have it be just part of your awareness, so that you can move through the world in ways that don't presume that you're better than someone else, even unconsciously. Someone who has had some good home training like that in my class is much less likely to shut down a conversation, I think.
For me, it's just, I've seen it, it's happened, it hasn't happened in much of my class, try to create an environment where people of all different perspectives are able to engage freely without having someone shut them down with a slanderous word. But our society, as we become more diverse, I think it's having some rupture feelings in how to deal with this rub of the diversity. And, you know, I will say, I did kind of worry when I hear young kids constantly saying, basically, the system. I want to know, you know, for me, when I was young, I grew up, and I mean, my parents grew up in time periods which I am sure were more racially oppressive than any of us would probably understand today. They were very apprehensive of shutting down conversation because they saw citizenship as not shutting down conversation, but opening conversation. So multicultural education, I think, studies is a way to open conversation. I'm all for it. If it's a way of victimization or shutting down conversations, even though I teach it, that's not what I want to teach. That's not who I want to be.
Can I ask actually both Mr. Rodriguez and Professor Latimore what you thought about the parts of the film that showed the little pledge that the children said is a poem that they say at the beginning? Yeah. Yeah.
What if I do harm to you, I do harm to myself, which is the basis of Mayan philosophy, which is you are the other me.
So there's a beautiful poetic version of it in English and Spanish the children said at the beginning of every class, and they said it at the demonstrations. Did you feel like that was just faked up for the camera, or you didn't believe what they were saying? It seemed very respectful to me.
I would have been more impressed if they would have said, do unto others as you do, as you would like them to do unto you.
Isn't that what they were saying?
Christian, in a Judeo, finish.
Could you speak for the mic, George, please?
I would have been more impressed if they would have made a Judeo-Christian statement or used a Judeo-Christian proverb or passage, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Why do they have to be? I mean, this thing that suddenly they've got to learn this someplace outside the home, and it's not in a religious context. I don't understand that. I mean, to me, what that is conveying to me is that the state is reprogramming the kid, and everybody's applauding.
George, doesn't the state through education program the kids anyway? And why is Judeo-Christian thought and philosophy more acceptable to you than Mayan philosophy, which is a true American philosophy and spirituality?
Because I think that as somebody that believes in Judeo-Christian values and someone who believes in God, I believe that, you know, it is better that there is a God and there is no Mayan God. I'm sorry.
The Mayans believed in God also.
Yes, there's a lot of God beliefs that are not under the
Well,
Judeo-Christian umbrella.
There we disagree, and we're getting into the religious aspects of it.
And
We
we guarantee
disagree.
freedom
I
of
believe
religion
in a
this
Christian
country.
God. That's it, okay? You're not going to dissuade me from that.
No one's trying to dissuade you.
No, what you're trying to
But
tell
to
me is that,
allow children to tap other heritage,
and that's
other
fine.
religious beliefs,
That's
should not
fine.
be
But
against.
why use that instead of teaching that at home?
Well, the Judeo-Christian could
I
also
mean,
be.
obviously, then something is wrong. Then they're not learning it at home. If they've got to go and learn a Mayan philosophical saying at school that touches them, then what are they learning at home?
Yeah. But everything we learn at school is exactly what we can't learn at home. That's why we have school. Because parents are busy. They can't be the only educators. They play a role.
What you're saying then is the very essence of a cultural foundation. The family does not have time for its own children,
But
and therefore the
that's
state has got to do it.
But that's often the case. And even parents with time and the best of intentions
So you're-
may not be effective teachers. You know, my dad believed that it was ridiculous to take driver's education.
Well, you know,
that you should learn
maybe
from
that's
your
what,
parents.
that's probably what's being promoted in the liberal colleges and universities, as well as in the media. But I'm sorry, I feel very, very strongly that the family, kids have got to learn respect. Kids have got to learn about their culture. Kids have got to, And when you say that parents don't have time for it,
Families, you say they should learn it wherever they want to get it.
Families are free to teach what they want, but our founding fathers also felt it was important to have a public school system, and that within that school, children would be educated. And that is what our issue is today, is what are children learning in the schools, and why are schools so much more effective and successful with high-income white children than they are with low-income brown or black children. That is a problem, and it is a real problem. It is in our face, and it is causing major problems throughout this nation as well as in other nations. What our schools teach and how they engage the different classes of society is what influences whether these children are successful, engaged, or able to pursue happiness, life, or liberty.
I just want to say something about the liberal education. I'm a Christian, I'm a minister, I'm a Baptist. Sees things for how it is. Now, I hope that answers the question about how I see it in class.
Yeah,
I facilitate. I don't try to convert people to my views change.
Right.
My job is there to facilitate.
So democracy is a work in progress, and that's why education is so important.
I think we really, I hope that those of you who are here, I think there's a lot of stuff that we all agree on. It's just whether the taxpayer should support it and how far we should go. I think that's the progress. I think sometimes we always see the left or the right or the this or the that. If we don't see that, I think we're all saying, in many ways, the same things. But how do we get there is probably a little bit more difficult, more heroic.
yeah, again, I am not in opposition to people learning about ethnic studies in any form or fashion. But my question is,
Except in schools, George.
Pardon?
Except in schools?
Well, if you'd let me finish.
Oh, excuse me. I just
Well,
want,
no,
as you had said,
what that shows right there, Dr.
I'm not a doctor.
Is your bias. Is your bias.
No, that's the
Yes,
fundamental
no, that is
question.
your bias. That is your bias.
That's a
showing.
question.
It is your bias showing. Okay?
I think all our biases show.
Because what it amounts to is that we've got professors, we've got an educational group, a group of educators that wants to push and promote, and that's why they want to push and promote their own industry, their own business,
Which is?
ethnic studies.
That's not all we teach here.
Well, that's what you're promoting. That's
No.
the name of the program. That's the name of the panel, isn't it?
And that is the question.
You
And that,
wanted to create a civil you wanted to become a civil right.
I think there's a
We
difference.
asked
I can
the question.
distinguish here between ethnic studies and multicultural education, which is actually the topic of the panel. All of us on this table, I believe, would rather see a multicultural education integrated throughout, with all students having access to that, than separating off and having to do the patch measures, the Band-Aid measures that we're having to do now because of the failures of the system to address issues appropriately for certain students. I believe
but that's not the case, Carmen.
multicultural
Because,
education.
for instance, the Texas Republican Party platform for 2012 says that it opposes multicultural education, and that, in fact, quote, that we believe the current teaching of a multicultural curriculum is divisive, and the platform adds that it supports teaching common American identity and loyalty instead of political correctness that nurtures alienation among racial and ethnic groups. So it's against the teaching of multicultural education.
And I need to clarify something, because this is one of my concerns about what's gone on in Arizona. And that is, it's a misnomer to say they have banned ethnic studies. They have not banned ethnic studies. They have banned Mexican American and indigenous studies. Their books still teach about the Irish, about the Puritans, about the early Anglo-American settlers. There is a lot of cultural, ethnic information in there, but it's about one ethnic group, and it is not the ethnic group that is the majority population of the region, or the coming majority population of the United States. So this is my concern. It is a misnomer. It is a lie for them to say they're banning ethnic studies. They're banning the study of ethnic groups other than the one that is in power. And that is not justice. It is not democracy. It is not fair. And it is what is causing a great deal of disparity between the educational level achieved by students of one ethnic group, whose culture is endorsed, affirmed, discussed, and talked about at length, and the other ethnic groups who are largely ignored.
And I keep hearing, George, and even yourself, Dr. Latimore, that this balkanization, that education is creating here in this society, this division, just like the party platform states here, that nurtures alienation among racial and ethnic groups. Was there ever togetherness amongst ethnic groups to begin with? And why would a multicultural education nurture or foster balkanization in the United States, when you want a true history of the people that made this nation what it is?
There are several ways that I can answer that. The one way that I would like to address that, when I use the word balkanization, obviously we've always been separate. I mean, I said initially, I grew up in a society that was black and white. That was the way that it was. It wasn't right. It was balkanized. I also said that there is a rub when all cultures try to come together. My fear is how the rub has become, and how I see some of my students interpret that rub. Sitting here, sitting there, sitting here, and finding some types of cultural identity that I'm not even sure they quite understand. My identity as a black man, and I'm proud of that, but it's as a rural black man. Do I identify, and when you say politics, I'm not a politician, and I'm not a member of either party. I don't happen to like either one of them. I think both of them pimp the people out. But that's just, I don't, that's neither here nor there. But my fear is that sometimes I can say, okay, I'm black. I got my culture, you got your culture, and we don't communicate about each other's culture. Now,
That's a different problem. Not communicating.
But that sometimes happens when we teach classes. And I say we should teach it. I've never said we should not. It's just a fear of the kind of society that we have where we're moving. And that goes for both not the Tea Party, but the more conservative Republicans that you're talking about who seem to want to balkanize it. And then on the other end, you have people who have, from a different perspective, but I would argue they too have some aspects that they could take a greater look at. I think all of us could find better ways of how to mix this hodgepodge of society that we have. And almost every society we see around the world has failed at. And we have an opportunity, and I feel that we're going in a direction, not because of multicultural education, but the implementation of it towards, that's my view of balkanization. Increasingly multicultural people, but yet we're sometimes not reflective of those kinds of changes that's come through.
I wish that I could share with you some of my experiences in ethnic studies classrooms, because I've sat in a lot of them, I've taught a lot of them, I've visited a lot of them, and by and large I find that what happens is an affirmation of individual diversity. That in the process of studying what a culture is, we learn that people are not little duplicates, they're all stereotypes of each other. We learn that there's a variation within each ethnic group, that there are overlaps between ethnic groups, that if you're black, that also means you're part white. If you're white, that means you're also part black. If you're Latino, you're not only indigenous and European, you're Arabic and Jewish and related to just about every ethnic group in the world because of the diversity of the Spanish Empire and the diversity of the American indigenous peoples and the blend of those. And that people going through the classroom, I have international students that take my classes, people from Africa, people from Asia, people who are from Kansas and never have another color or another culture walk into their block. My experience is that when they leave the classroom, they feel more celebratory of their own culture. They feel prouder of who they are because they're able to identify what cultural values exist, which ones they share, which ones they have in common with people from other ethnic groups, which ones people in that own ethnic group don't have in common with each other. You know, they come out of there a little more affirmed as individuals because they have been educated on the nature of culture and ethnicity. Ethnic studies is not a dirty word.
I teach Black history. So I mean, these are things that happen in my classroom. I'm only saying sometimes it can be implemented in a patchwork type way, and that's my fear of how it's done. I've never said ethnic studies is a bad thing. I've never said multicultural education is a bad thing. I believe in that. I do not believe, however, that I'm affirmed by what happens in the classroom. I come into the classroom affirmed. I have to expect that out of myself. And that's just, I don't expect anybody to affirm me. I have to find that from, and that's a very personal thing for me.
We hope you're enriched, though.
Yeah,
We hope you're
can't
enriched.
expect anybody else to do that for me.
And I agree with what Dr. Latimore is saying, and I just want to add to it, that affirmation shouldn't begin in the classroom. I'm sorry, Dr. Tafolla, it shouldn't begin. And if that's where we're headed for affirmation from the state for children, well, that's what it sounds like, okay? Now, let me tell you, the other thing that it sounds like is,
We pay the taxes there for the state.
well, and that's fine, that's good. So therefore, the state should affirm you, then? Is that what you're saying? Instead of
children
the
are 5
family
years
first.
old or
The
4
family should
years
do it
old,
first.
they are very vulnerable.
Sure,
The family should do it first. Let me finish.
Yes, and families can do whatever they want. We are not legislating what families do.
Well, apparently you're trying to at this point, because what you're trying to do is say that it's a civil right.
Schools are paid by our taxes.
So therefore, the school should affirm the kid. The kid should not receive.
Isn't that what education is about?
I'd like to come back to the educational center of this.
Wait,
If we look at educational psychologists like Vygotsky, learning is relational. Learning does not happen in isolation. It happens in relationship to another person. So the vital relationship in education is between the student and that teacher. There, you become engaged. It is not independent. It's not in a book.
The
The
parent
parents
pays
at home after they get back from school. So, unless you believe that the child never leaving home, we're talking about what happens during the school day. We're talking about, unless you want nothing to happen during the school day. Something happens during the school day. And that's something for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, even 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old is vitally interrelational. They are in a process of development. No, I do not need affirmation in the classroom. You do not need affirmation in the classroom. We're mature professionals. We're talking about young people, our most vulnerable young people, and they do need affirmation, and any teacher will tell you that.
And the fact of the matter is that the educational system has the young students much more time than the parents have it. Have them. I mean, they're there 8, 9 hours a day, sometimes more.
So we want to get it right.
Work,
So that
and then they're
justifies.
just there. They play a little while, go do homework, go to sleep, eat, and go to sleep.
Well, if they do homework, usually they get home and they watch more TV as well. So,
But they
so
have
not
to
only
take
is the
9 hours
teacher,
more a day,
not
so-
only is the teacher and affirming them, but also the media is affirming them. And then you wonder why we've got the problem with kids that we've got now.
I didn't have, this is all good. I mean, I want this. I did have it, you know, when I was in school, I was not a person that paid much attention to anything. I mean, they could have had, you know, they could show much of anything. I wouldn't have been listening. I didn't listen to it. I graduated with a big old 2.8 GPA. That was just the way that it was because I didn't care. Even if they tried to affirm me or whatever, but my affirmation came from home. And that was, I guess, and maybe this is my other side, you know, I fear a society in which we expect teachers, and my mother's a teacher, and my wife is a teacher, where we expect them to do what the society or the people or the communities or everybody else is unwilling or unable to do. It cannot do that. But we can certainly teach all these kinds of things. Your book, I want it there. I have no problem with that at all. I guess we're close, and we're somewhat close. It's just how do we do this in a way that we allow different American perspectives to come into play without without making everybody feel uncomfortable. So I can only feel comfortable if I'm in my Black Studies class, so this person can only feel uncomfortable if they're in that class. I fear that in our society, politically, socially, economically, as fragmented as we are, I'm just afraid of where all of us, and it's not just multicultural ethnic studies, that's a part of this is part of a larger thing where as we become more diverse, I feel we become more separate. And that scares me. Yes.
But you do
The question.
So that's a great place to go to practice those skills of public engagement, of coming together in the marketplace to exchange ideas. That seems like a really good use of a public education, to be in Professor Latimore's class and learn how to be courteous while talking about difficult issues with each other.
Transfer to Trinity University, everybody. But I'm not saying that I'm perfect, and and none of us are. And I think all of us are trying to find a way to navigate a difficult situation, a difficult society. I just hope we find a way to do it with dignity and respect of all. And I feel that in our society, we have not done that. Our people have less empathy for other groups, and we've seen that in studies. Empathy, sympathy, understanding. Those things seem to be decreasing at the same time we're talking about these things. And that's from all perspectives. And so I guess I fear, we could talk about race better when I was younger than I find people are able to talk about race today. And I hate to say that's a shame. That I have students come to me, well, Dr. Latimore, how do I say this? And they point to my hand and they said, that. I said, oh, Black? Well, how do I say it? African American or Black or this or that? I said, Black.
But you were a young person, I'm guessing, in the 70s?
Yeah.
I mean, when the civil rights movement had engaged this discussion, we're not talking about you being a young person in the 1950s or the 1940s.
I'm talking
So,
about the 80s and 90s.
okay.
That's, I grew up
Right.
in 170.
So this discussion had already come forth. It was already being discussed. We've been in a long cooking process here of trying to get this done. And sometimes we make 3 steps forward and 10 steps back.
My feeling is that we have become the United Tribes of America rather than the United States.
United what?
Tribes of America rather than the United States. And I just want to know, when do kids learn national unity? I mean, that's my fear, is when do we learn national unity if we are more concerned about our ethnicity, our race, our sexual orientation, et cetera, and if that becomes primary.
Why can't we celebrate our diversity within our national unity?
I don't know, can we?
I think we should, and we can. We should. It's incumbent upon us to do that.
I would hope that we could.
I have one other question here, and it's going to be quick because I do want to get to the questions here from the audience. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in Article 14 states that Indigenous peoples have the right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions, providing education in their own languages in a manner appropriate to their cultural methods of teaching and learning, that the states shall, in conjunction with Indigenous peoples, take effective measures in order for Indigenous individuals, particularly children, including those living outside their communities, to have access, when possible, to an education in their own culture and provided in their own language. And then finally states, Indigenous peoples have the right to the dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, histories, and aspirations, which shall be appropriately reflected in education and public information. Do you agree with that, George?
Yes, and I will agree with that. I will support that when Rwanda takes action, when the Balkans, when Croatia respects Serbians, when Georgians respect Russians. I will respect that. I think that the United States is doing the best it can, and I don't think that the United Nations has any political right to tell a sovereign nation what to do. And I applaud it, and I think the United States is doing what it should.
Anybody have any comments on the Declaration of Indigenous Rights and how it pertains to the United States of America in particular?
Me, again, it's just, and maybe this is my own background, the idea of the state shaping everything about me, that bothers me. And maybe that's because I grew up with parents, you know, my parents are much older, and so they grew up in the 40s. And so, again, for me, it's got to come, you know, obviously we have the state has a role, but the family, the community also has a role. And as we're having these conversations, I think part of the reason why we have these conversations is because other aspects of our societies has changed and fallen off.
But it is the responsibility of the state to educate its children.
Yeah, and it is. I'm not saying it is. I'm not saying it's like a homeschool education system.
You're going to homeschool your kids. Then.
I never said that. I will send
No,
them.
I'm asking.
I will send them to a public school.
It's the state.
I'm not going to be like a lot of parents who are going to send their kids to the most private school they are to get them away from everybody else.
Our children are in the hands of the state.
But I will not let my state determine what my children are.
When they have them 9 hours a day,
They will not determine who my kid is.
when they have them 9 hours a day, 5 days a week, and you have them blood pressure, what do you mean? They're not going to determine what's right?
They're not determined.
They should not determine.
These are impressionable children. You don't think that the teacher...
You should be able to remove your children from the school if the school is not teaching what you and your home and values are.
Let me say something about the state.
I agree with that. We pay the tax.
Maybe this is my fear about the state. We have other state-controlled governments running around this world that believe a similar thing. The state has a right to control everything. I don't believe that. That's not that I'm not pro-democratic. I am. I just don't want the state telling me what my child should believe. I don't want the state influencing my child in my religious education. It's not that it would. But it's only can go so far.
But it does.
And I don't like the idea of them telling me how my kids should be thinking religiously or, that's not the state's job.
Religion should be involved there, although there's some people that want religion in public schools, right?
I'm not, this is not, I'm saying religion as an example, but I will not relinquish any agency because it's just the way I am. I am an individual. My kids will be an individual. I will raise them to be an individual. I will not raise them to be controlled by people who 1 year may be one way, and next year that group might be knocked out and there'll be another group of people in.
And that's really the way it operates right now.
The way
It
things
also
happen in
depends on
Texas.
who the teacher is, right, for your child at that school.
It's just, for me, my ancestors were slaves, many of them. They were controlled. That's what slavery is about now. In their mind, they were free. But they still didn't have control over their body. I reject anything in any society, any situation, which has at its intent to control what I think and do.
And that's part of the problem, is because I think that our schools do control our children. And we just wonder if they're going to have that much power over our children, and they do, that at least they'll teach us a true history and teach us to be positive and proud of who we are, as well as our parents, obviously not relinquishing any responsibility away from the parents, and that's very important. We have equal parts, but the schools have our children for 9, 10 hours a day, every day.
Do you trust it?
No, I don't.
And maybe that's the problem. Maybe they should not have
We
them.
are the schools, and that's what
Maybe they shouldn't have them that long.
What is happening?
I actually love seeing the young people in that film so engaged with their education and so determined not to let anyone control what they think or do or say, but actually speak up about their own experience and save our classes. I loved the civic engagement and the commitment to their democracy that those students displayed.
Let's move to some questions now from the audience. There's a microphone here. If you have people to step up, I know you had a question. It's a very important dialogue and discussion. I want to thank all of y'all for being here and the panel for really lively discussion here.
Thank you all for being here and for this discussion. I wanted there were much more college students. I just wanted to share some ideas with the college students. My name is Felipe. I'm from this neighborhood. I grew up in Indian Creek right down the street, attended schools here, came to community college here. But more importantly, as an organizer, I've taught in the Freedom Schools in Arizona, and I've worked with there's various engagements against the state in struggling for their own education. So I just wanted to mention a couple of things that haven't been mentioned. and to clarify a couple of points that were made by our speakers. First and foremost, people don't just wake up one day and say, we've been harmed, we're doing the wrong thing. Tucson School District was forced to create this education initiative by the Supreme Court because for decades they had been miseducating the children in Tucson in very segregated spaces. So the Supreme Court ordered that school district, like many school districts across the country, to desegregate. And this was their plan. The community said, this is what we think is important, right? And so that was a very important point that I haven't heard brought out. Secondly, there's a lot of discussion about the Constitution. Education isn't in the Constitution. It's left up to the states. Read the whole thing. It doesn't lay out how we should structure schools. It's laid out to the state. And in Texas, earlier this week, yet again, it's unconstitutional in the way we fund our schools. So we have to go back to that discussion. But before that, there's this whole conversation at the end about teachers and controlling kids. And it's just really important that as an educator, as a community member, my mother has so much respect for the teacher. The school is our second home. They're responsible for the safety of us and the children. And we hope that our schools is like a home for our kids, not a place where they're deculturalized or talked down to or only imposed a Judeo-Christian mindset, knowing that we are very diverse. If you look at the dollar bill, it says, E pluribus unum. From many, we try to become one, which is why I have an issue personally as an educator, as a former university professor, with this word multicultural. Because there's this idea that there's multiple races. And if you hear Gilbert, one of our kids who's in the film, he says, we're one race. We're one human race. And we have a whole bunch of intercultural differences and diversity, but we don't have all these multiple cultures and multiple humans all over the world. We have one human race. In Lakesh, you are mi otro yo. If I can see my spirit in you, whether you're from some other part of the world, we're still human beings. And I'll close with my last point. And it has to do with Mr. Rodriguez's characterization and also Dr. Latimore's characterization of being an individual, because I think it's really important. And first of all, he came out here saying that I don't want to be everybody's piñata and I want people to respect me. And the first thing he comes out is throwing chingazos. And the first thing he comes out is being disrespectful, being on his cell phone. So it's really important to practice what you preach. And that's what the students are learning in this school. Right? But above all, let's stop tippy-toeing about what this conversation is about. The conversation in Arizona and San Antonio and across the world is about these ideas of how we organize ourselves around money, equity, and wealth. This whole idea of talking about schools, about cultural capital and cultural wealth, and more importantly, the idea that the purpose of a school is to earn money. The purpose of our schools is not just to earn. This learn to earn paradigm is what's screwing us up. We have to have something different, learning for freedom, learning for liberation, learning to stop poverty, learning to stop trauma, learning to stop deportation. So I agree that it is about the individual, but it's because the individual has a responsibility to the community. And the founding fathers, I'm sorry, people think of them as giants, but as an educator, they were slave owners. They owned slaves, plain and simple. And you can laugh and laugh at me, but Benjamin Franklin had his views, and we all have our own contradictions. Everyone on the panel has their contradictions. I have my contradictions. But what's important about all of these conversations about this film, Precious Knowledge, at the end of the day, we all have the responsibility to know that the system is us. We make up that system. It's not them against us. Individually, forming together, communicating, relating with one another, create this community, create these schools. And in Arizona, they weren't working. And in San Antonio, they're not working. So obviously, we have to move on with this definition. And lastly, the most kind of difficult thing to talk about is we've been hearing this word American across the board. I'm American, I'm American. As a history teacher, we know that America is 3 continents. The United States doesn't control the definition of what it is to be American. And so it's really important to define these terms and labels that we don't want to be labeled into. And saying we're talking about the United States. None of those teachers said, I'm American. They said, this is the United States. And it's really important to understand the distinction between owning American globally and just saying that we have a very diverse community. We want to respect everybody that's here. And yes, we got to come together, but it's not to come together to separate ourselves. It's to come together so that everybody has a more kind of less traumatic experience in this world in the little time that we have. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Therefore, you have a question?
It's a hard act to follow. I have a brief question or brief comment. From a reliable source, I understand that in universities, the enrollment in cultural programs has declined. Perhaps you might comment on that. I mean, it leads us to thinking that this is sort of a post period. But anyway, if you might comment.
That's not the
Did
case
you,
with
did you
university
understand the
tests.
question? I did not quite understand it.
Yeah, I think the question was, correct me if I'm wrong, that this might be kind of passé now because enrollment in ethnic studies or multicultural studies programs is declining. No, okay, then I didn't understand. Sorry.
Something's going on where in universities the enrollment in these programs is declining. It's at a different level. That there might be something that's already accepted, at least at university levels, in that sense.
Well, I don't have the facts and figures about any kind of like nationwide enrollment, but I can tell you that at the University of Texas at Austin, just last year, we've long had a program in African diaspora studies that was not a department, so it didn't have the same status. It wasn't, you couldn't major in it. And we just started a new major last year that has, I think, 250 students enrolled in it. So it's certainly not the case at the University of Texas.
So when we have a training, we have an African American Studies program, which is minor, just like we were talking about the African Studies program. When I got there, we had 0 minors. Now we have roughly between 80 and 10 who graduate a semester, which is not that bad when you think of it as a minor. So it has increased tremendously. Maybe 10% of those students are of African or African American descent. So
Because it's
I think
really
we're going
interesting.
the right way.
You don't have to be black to be interested in African American studies. It's fascinating.
I think we're going the right way. It's just
At UTSA, do you think that enrollment in Mexican American studies or other ethnic studies is declining?
I don't have the exact figures. I do know that overall enrollment at UTSA has gone way up, and that we now have an African American Studies program that is stronger, a Women's Studies program that is stronger, an LGBT program that is stronger. We have more options under Mexican American Studies for different kinds of majors. You don't just major in Mexican American Studies or minor in Mexican American Studies. You can actually incorporate it with other studies such as bilingual bicultural education or cultural literacy and language, so that the ability to integrate ethnic studies, not to pull it off to one side, but to integrate it with your regular role of study in your process of becoming a social worker, an educator, an engineer, that you are able to incorporate the knowledge that cultural competencies give in different ethnic studies. So we've had some successes and interest.
And in my experience here at Palo Alto College, we have a Mexican American Studies degree program here. I must preface this by saying that since the late 60s and early 70s, when a lot of these programs came into being at universities primarily and colleges, that they've been under constant attack. And I think that over the years, the institutional support at different colleges and universities has dwindled, and I think as a result of a lot of different factors. And I don't think that we necessarily have the institutional support here that we need. But I've seen the opposite here, that little by little, as we start to promote it more, that our classes are growing in Mexican American Studies. So I don't know if that's a gauge across the nation, but there's battle lines on all fronts. You know, it depends on the individual institution. Yes, sir.
Well, it's good to see you and George were around the same age. Those young ladies are much younger, and it's obviously this other fellow's younger too. But we did a lot of stuff in the movimiento. My name is Ralph Velasquez, and I'm not an alcoholic. So, but I want to say something to Mr. George over there. I'm not a very good Christian, but I'm a damn good Catholic. And as a Catholic, we are universally tolerant of things and universally accepting of things. And the real thing that we're talking about, because I don't believe that it is a civil right. I believe that education, Chicano studies, is an economic right. Because the civil rights movement was the precursor to the new movement that's coming on now, and that's economic rights. You know, if you don't have a job, you don't have a home. If you don't have a job, you can't get educated. It's an economic rights movement that is hitting this country now. I don't use the N-word not because it's offensive to you, but because it's offensive to me. That's the Mayan thought. We believe in that. We believe we're not going to go hurt other folks unless we want to hurt ourselves. And that's something, George, that we grew up with. My father was a butcher at Swift & Company. My mother was a seamstress at Fine Silver. Both were sweatshops in a way. But they believed in education. And they believed that we had to bootstrap it up, because when they came back from World War II, decorated, they were still discriminated against. We still had to live on this side of the tracks. And the tracks for us was Culebra Street. The discrimination that your parents received, the civil rights offenses that they received, we had the same thing here. We had vigilantes called Texas Rangers who went ahead and killed hundreds and hundreds of our people. But yet, we have not assimilated. We have transformed America. We still have our names. We still have our religion. We still have our languages. And we still have our customs. So when people say that this America, which I'm a proud veteran, this America which we fought for, is a melting pot, I feel very offended by that. This is not a melting pot. We're much too smarter for that. This is a caldo. Because the caldo, you can taste all the ingredients. And a caldo is good for you. A melting pot serves no purpose other than to melt something. We are people of intelligence. We are people of knowledge. And we are people of experience. And we will not ever be an apologia for failure for this country. On the other hand, we are the reason that this country is getting better and better. We are the reason why it is now we the people. It was never we the people when it was founded. It was we the white men of privilege in order to form a more better advantage. But now we have made it to the point, because of these studies and because of the renaissance of our awareness, which we're always aware, we just got out of the closet, okay? And we look at it and we're saying, yeah, we're making it better because those kids are worth it. So I would totally support this, not under a civil rights, because it's not a civil right. It's an economic rights, because that's what this country was founded on. And in order for this country to move forward, we got to keep pushing economic rights. That's inclusive rather than exclusive.
Thank you, Ralph.
I want to comment on the indigenous issue. This is no accident that this is happening in Arizona, of all states of the nation that has the most Native American tribes, reservations, individuals, issues, governments going on. We didn't even deal with it there, but it was no accident that they chose this Mayan term with which to begin the day. And I believe that not only because of the content and the level of respect that it reflected, but also the message it gave the young children, who are not being treated as indigenous peoples, but are being treated as foreigners, who have no right to be here, who are recently arrived, who, don't even have their own parents in the country, who are parents are at risk of being deported because they're told they have no right to be here. And so that's where the whole issue of indigenous rights comes in. And do people who have lived on a continent for hundreds of thousands of years, who have worked, who have built it, who have built the country, who are still paying to that country and following its laws, do they have a right to be here? So that when we start to talk about indigenous realities, La Vera Mata is Arizona. It's happening right there. Even the Chicanos, they may call themselves Chicanos, but you dig a little bit below the surface and you find out that Grandpa was a Yaqui and Mama was a Tarahumara, and so it becomes an indigenous reality. And the crossovers between the ethnic groups, between the indigenous and the Chicano ethnic groups in Arizona are very, very deep and very, very strong. And you can walk onto a Papago reservation and talk to the little kids and say, hey, ¿qué tal jugando? The little kids say, you speak Papago. Because the blending has happened, the ethnic blending has happened. So they're beginning to identify both ethnic groups together.
So obviously Chicanos are indigenous peoples, right? Mexicans are indigenous here to this continent. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you for putting this together. The film, and that's in particular the students, took me back to my student days, and I was actually at UT Austin when Lisa first came there, and Dr. Moore came there. My name is Kamala Platt. I've been teaching for several decades, a couple decades, but I wanted to think back to, I was thinking back to my student days, and I sort of want to address this to the students, but sort of raise a question in thinking back to what some of them were saying, but also in thinking about my experience at UT Austin. I was in comparative literature, and I think I would rephrase that question to be, is multicultural or whatever education a human right? And by that I would make it, and that's sort of a Malcolm X thing, and that would make it more of a world question for all of us, and I would say that it is, and then I would say let's go ahead and talk about how that can happen. And just as an example of how I saw that happening in the classroom, in my courses, I took some courses in Brazilian literature. The first thing that I thought of earlier in the conversation, one thing that I learned there was a Brazilian poet came to speak to us, and in Brazil the poets are so respected that they have their own parking lot. And I wish, I think, I'm not saying America, the United States is less than Brazil, but I wish we could learn from that example, and I think the mayor in creating a poet laureate for us has gone in that direction. The second thing I wanted to say was that I was reading and all this work in Brazilian literature, and Brazilian modernism is a very interesting thing. It's wonderful. We were having wonderful speakers. We talked a lot about issues of race. And in Brazil, it's different. And what I kept hearing was, well, we all have a little bit of African blood in us or whatever. We're not racist in Brazil or in the same way, which it's not in the same way. And that's what I learned until we had a couple speakers and then a whole conference that was on Black Brazil and a couple speakers that were Afro-Brazilian. And then I heard a whole different story. And that, I think, is what this is all about. It's to get everybody's perspective there on the table and discussed in the classrooms. And we really learned as much. I taught the World Lit too, but for non-native speakers of English. And so I had my students bring in their literature that they wanted to share, and we did an anthology of world literature in that way. I think that's what, students here push for those things. We've got to push the envelope. I'm speaking as a student now, I guess, because I'm unemployed anyway, but we've got to push the envelope to the higher standards that I think these students brought for us, and I'd like comments.
Thank you, Kamala. And there are some people that do say that the teaching of ethnic studies and a multicultural education, and as the gentleman said early on, the first speaker, ethnic studies and a multicultural education are two different things, even though they're related, but there are different things. There's some people that say it is a civil right, as Ralph said, an economic right, and other people are saying it is a human right, that we've taught our history, our culture, as a declaration of human rights and rights of the indigenous people states by the United Nations. Yes, sir.
Hi. It's been a while since I've been in the classroom.
Can you get a little bit closer to the mic?
Yeah, it's been a while since I've been in the classroom, but and I find this discussion very interesting and enlightening. I have a daughter who teaches in the San Antonio public school system, and I have a granddaughter who teaches in the San Antonio public school system. So I have some insight into what's happening in the lower grade elementary public schools. A question that I would address to the panel, it's my perspective that because of the influx of what we're calling multicultural studies, the actual study of the United States has been relegated in our history books to, in many cases, a page, and in most cases, merely a paragraph. Whereas when I went to school in a northeast state where I was born and which I quickly fled from, we had a year of history, American history. So I'm kind of concerned that we're looking at this ethnic studies, multicultural studies, to such a degree that we're forgetting why we're looking at ethnic studies and multicultural studies. And that is, hopefully, to bring all the people together, perhaps not a melting pot, as Mr. Vasquez said, but a caldo. My wife is a Hispanic immigrant. She happens to be from Venezuela. Through tragic circumstances, her 86-year-old mother is now living with us, and I love her to pieces. She speaks not a word of English. So at my rather advanced age, I'm learning Spanish. But see, that's not so bad because I was a Russian linguist, and I learned German, and I learned Japanese, and the GIs do those things. Something that came up about indigenous people that bothers me. I have a blood brother, a real blood brother, the ceremony and all, with a Comanchero, okay, from Oklahoma. He is the most fiercely angry person about what is happening to the nations that have their own government and their own reservations. He says, if you want to see what could be in store for the United States, go to an Indian reservation.
Go to where?
An Indian reservation.
You're American Indian.
An American Indian reservation. Even when the tribe runs the reservation, the same situation exists. I have mine, you stay down there and don't bother me because I'm the chief or I'm the mayor or I'm whatever. So I don't bring a lot of wisdom to this party. But it seems to me that everything you're trying to say is useless if the end result doesn't better the country that we live in. Yugoslavia was the perfect example of what it's my language, it's my religion, it's my ethnicity can do, where a country that lived together as we did, or as we do hopefully, suddenly, overnight, became a country that slaughtered their next door neighbors without thinking a thing about it. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, sir, and your question. Do you think it's true that the United States is not teaching U.S. history because of ethnic studies or multicultural studies?
No, that's not possible.
I think what we're getting is a more in-depth, more detailed teaching of the history. We're not just memorizing when the Boston Tea Party happened or when a law was passed. We're learning more about what the group of factions were that supported or didn't support it, what the implications were for different ethnic groups. I think it becomes a more in-depth study.
And I'm going to run.
Yeah, because he's going to have to leave back to Trinity, and we're getting ready to wrap up here. So yes, go ahead, Cary.
I just wanted to say that when I look at American history, there is an American narrative. And when I teach the African-American experience, the African-American experience is part of that larger narrative. And so when we look at Thomas Jefferson and all the people, we look at it as part of the American narrative as well. African-American narrative is just one way of looking at it. I think we're going in some interesting directions. I think it's a good discussion to have. I just hope that we find a way to do it before we come together instead of separate ourselves, because in my mind, that's what being American or a U.S. citizen or all those things mean.
And thank you, Dr. Latimore, for those comments. I think we have maybe time for like one or two more questions.
This is just a real quick question. George, you're unique up here on the panel because you're trying to influence local politics. And so I'm wondering if you could share with the audience what the Alliance, the South Texas Political Alliance, is doing. I guess in these local elections right now, what sort of activities you're involved in politically, locally, on a local level.
We're really not doing anything at this point. We were involved in the campaign in opposition to the pre-K. We have voiced our opinion on the trolley system. But at this point, we're not really doing anything other than just analyzing what's going on at City Hall and at the county courthouse.
Thank you. Another
I
quick
hope you're
question.
nicer to me when you write your column.
I think these are the last two here. Oh, you have done, so we're going to have to make them quick here. All right.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for your time and your energy of being here. My name is Dolores Valles. I'm a parent volunteer at my kids' school at Brack High School in Bonham Academy. It's kind of it's more of a comment. It's touching base in the education system and how our state is taking the identity of our kids. With all these standardized testing going on, it feels like my kids are taking more time at school because they do have to learn all these the STEM subjects, science, math, mathematics, and technology. But I have two awesome kids that were born out of wedlock. They're poets, photographers. We're in depth with our culture and learning every day. What I wanted to say is that I'm a parent who loves my kids, who has, I am not going to have the state take over their identity and their education and their personality because they do belong to me. And I think that they definitely need that spiritual reinforcement so that they can go on every single day to give back to their community. And I enforce that they have to work out their nutrition, their health, their mental, spiritual, emotional state is always important. And education is always the best thing. And yes, it is the melting pot. We're always saying, okay, it's Galdo, or it's, whoever it is that we come in our paths with for that season in our life, we're thinking, okay, why is this person in our life? And what lesson am I going to get out of it, positive or negative? But me and my kids are always in depth with our education and our community and giving back and learning with this journey that we're put upon. I would rather be broke and struggling right now and be in my kids' life and in depth in their conversation and their education. I'm there at my son's high school every single day, and I'm sitting in his classroom when he doesn't do well, because the kids and the faculty need to know that these parents, and I'm one of them, who is there and who cares for my kids' education. And tomorrow my son and I will be giving a speech at the Save Our Texas Schools legislative update, and we're also rallying families to gather at Breckenridge High School February 23rd so that we can rally in March on behalf of Saving Our Texas School to give a voice to the faculty, our families, the public school system, and to let the legislators know that we're not going to tolerate that they're taking more money away from our kids' education, because that's who we are, and education, gaining our knowledge and our voice and our power is always going to be there in front of us. And no matter what color, culture, experiences that we have, then when we rally together, no matter what color we are, backgrounds, then we come in power in numbers.
Thank you. Some very important points. Yeah, the money is important, and obviously the judge once again said that education in Texas is unconstitutional. Again, I think we understand that because of the funding situation here, rich and poor school districts. Yes, sir. Quick question.
There's a quick question for George Rodriguez. It's not to pick on you or nothing, but you talk about parents teaching their children, but when, as a minority, we were denied a good, sound education. We were given an education, but when you compare the Edgewood School District to the Northeast School District, that's not equal, that's not fair. how do you expect an uneducated parent to teach their child about their history, their heritage, and their culture that they don't even know?
Let me begin by answering that question by saying that the experience of the Mexican Americans today that have crossed the border, or they're crossing the border, is, in my opinion, the same as any immigrant group that has come to the United States. However, I think that the difference nowadays is that we have a cultural, and this is not just as far as Mexican Americans or Mexican immigrants, I think that we have a cultural attitude in society now, or a societal attitude, that we want immediate need, that we want our needs looked after immediately. Whereas it took one generation to become American and to move up the ladder economically. I think today we want it to happen all immediately. I also believe very, very strongly that if a parent on one side of an economic of a low-income part of town wants to educate their child and wants their child to attend a perceived better school because it is on the wealthier side of town, I think that we should allow for vouchers so that that individual can go. I don't think we need to give money to... Well, I just don't think, sir, that we need to give money anymore to school systems that are failing. I think we should I believe very strongly in the market economics, in the market system.
And that's a whole other question. That's controversial. You know, that's a different panel there, George, but we appreciate it. And we have one final quick question. Oh, we had two. I thought we only had one. We need to do this quick.
I will do this as quickly as possible. First of all, thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it. My name is Rosa Cavazos, and it's been a pleasure listening to everybody's comments. First of all, I'm so glad that we all agree we are Americans, okay?
No, United States.
Okay, we are Americans. Being an Air Force veteran, okay, I have learned how to become an American. Now, I'm also a Mexican American. I wear that hat with pride, 5th generation Texan. I've had to defend being not just a Mexican American, but a Texan outside of Texas many times. Growing up in the 70s, I tried to join the Army, okay? The thing is, at that time, you had to...
But you know, if you want ethnic studies and you want your kids to be taught, you know, about your history and culture in your schools, you need to petition it. You have to go to the school boards. You need to get organized, and I think it's very important that we all do that. Be involved in our children's education and within our community, right? So right now we have a free reception right out in the lobby, and there's a table out there with our Somos Mas new student organization here at Palo Alto College with some information. So we appreciate you taking some of that and spreading the word. Thank you once again for being with us, and I hope to see you soon. Welcome to come out some food and drink with us.